Hello and welcome to the Beautiful Truths webinar on Inspiring Infinity, why businesses must look beyond their own lifetimes. I'm Adam Penny, the CEO and co-founder of The Beautiful Truth, a magazine and creative studio that celebrates the individuals and businesses who are embracing life with purpose for a kinder, greener and more equitable world. And with me to discuss why businesses must look beyond their own lifetimes are three distinguished individuals, all who feature in the current edition of The Beautiful Truth magazine. Sophie Howe, who was the world's first Future Generations Commissioner in Wales from 2016 up to this year, where her role was to represent a constituency that does not vote, work, or even exist. Charles Wookey, co-founder and former CEO of A Blueprint for Better Business, a non-profit advisory organization whose purpose is to create a better society through better business. And he's advised and continues to advise some of the world's most influential businesses and leaders. And finally, Chris DeJory, the co-founder and CEO of Leaders on Purpose, a global community of purpose-driven leaders that work with businesses, governments, and non-profit organizations all around the world to support businesses transitioning to becoming more sustainable and fit for the future. So we're going to delve into their backgrounds and learn from their experience before getting into the subject of inspiring infinity. And Sophie, I want to start with you first. Tell us, the first Minister for Future Generations, what was your journey to that? How did that come about?
Well, I've got I suppose, a long history working in sort of public policy, predominantly the public sector. And I suppose that long history also came with a lot of frustration about the way that public policy is designed and public services are run. I'm a big fan of public services, but I'm not a big fan of the fact that, generally everything we do is very short term. My job before being Future Generations Commissioner, I was Deputy Police Commissioner in our largest police force here in Wales, and essentially, what the police were doing there were picking up problems that have gone wrong elsewhere in the system. Often re-traumatizing people in that system and making the situation worse. And that's all because we take a very short-term view on things. We don't look to the long term. We don't try and prevent problems from occurring or often even getting worse. And we definitely don't join up our policies and our services. And we often don't make them people-centered either.
Mm-hmm. How did even a concept of a Future Generations Commissioner come about?
Well, it started its life as a manifesto commitment, which simply said we will legislate for sustainable development. And actually, a minister at the time, Jane Davidson, had sort of conceived this idea of we must put some more meat on the bone of what we mean by sustainable development, because it's a word that is words that are sort of bandied around, but it doesn't actually necessarily mean anyone is taking action and operating in a sustainable way. And she was frustrated by that. So she wanted to put some more specific legislative duties. She managed to get that commitment in the Labour manifesto, and then actually retired from government at that election. So the new government were left with something that had been her baby that they had now committed to do. And fortuitously, they actually then held a national conversation with the citizens of Wales to say, OK, what's the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come? And so it was the people of Wales who decided that we should have these 7 long-term wellbeing goals. And that's our vision for Wales that we want to leave behind.
Okay, and what did they include?
So a prosperous Wales, which is quite interesting because it talks about a productive, innovative, low-carbon society, one which uses resources efficiently and proportionately. No reference to GDP. We're working towards a wellbeing economy here. Goals around nature, goals around cohesive communities, equality, health, and culture and language, and so on. Okay,
and you took those 7 long-term goals and you turned them into a manifesto, didn't you, in 2020?
Yeah. So so my job was to both advise the government and our other public institutions covered by the Future Generations Act to provide inspiration and identify what are the things that, if we get them right, the policy areas, or what are the things that we can do will make the biggest contribution across each of those 7 wellbeing goals? Because often when we're trying to deliver things, we're only delivering things in silos. So one of the things that I proposed is that we should completely reform the way that we think about transport, because we need to be thinking about transport and mobility in a way which is not just going to get us from A to B, and with the economic benefits and necessity of that, but actually is going to improve our health, be fit for the long term, is going to help us meet our carbon emissions targets, is going to bring communities together. So a complete rewrite of the way that we do transport in Wales. So we are no longer making most of our investment in building roads, which is what we were doing previously. And that investment is shifted towards public transport, because that's much better if you're from a poorer background, it's better for your health, it's better for carbon emissions, and it's better for communities. So it's about thinking about everything that we do through the lens of these 7 wellbeing goals.
Okay. And then how do you, because obviously you've got I don't know, different leaders, different members coming in, all the time. You're in the normal sort of electoral cycle. How do you manage to kind of transfer it between those in power?
Well, essentially what the Act does is it sets out these 7 long-term goals set out in law. So they don't change from one electoral cycle to the next. The way in which, or the steps that different political parties might take to deliver them will change, but the goals themselves don't change. And that's incredibly powerful, because what it's meant in Wales is that we've got all of our organisations, and the Act applies only to the public sector, but increasingly what we're seeing is the private sector saying, do you know what, there's something really kind of valuable in a country, a long-term vision of where it's going. Now, you wouldn't think that that was revolutionary, would you, for a country to have a long-term vision, but it's completely revolutionary. All other countries operate on the basis of one electoral cycle to the next. So it's incredibly powerful to have that, and to have a whole Team Wales approach to delivering this long-term vision.
What was we were talking earlier, and you were talking about government spending more time thinking about ice cream than the future.
Yeah, this is something that Professor Toby Ord, who's a professor of existential threat at Oxford University, and I always say, you definitely, well, he says that there's a 1 in 6 chance that humanity won't survive beyond the end of this century, and governments across the world are absolutely woeful at thinking and planning for the future, and particularly existential threat. And he says that globally we spend more money on the purchase of ice cream than governments spend on embedding foresight in looking at future trends and potential risks and scenarios. And I think he's absolutely right, but I think the challenge that I would kind of give back there is, when we're being asked to look at the future, generally we're only being asked to think about what are the risks that might be coming our way. Everything we often think about the future is dystopian, and this is where a country with a vision, a positive vision, what do we want our country to look like, that's that on its head, and it enables us to say, if we want to go there, these are the steps that we need to take now in order to get us there.
Yeah, I find this concept really interesting of, should we just be mitigating risks, or should we be building looking or creating in our minds a story of a future that's inspiring and exciting? And you're right that when we look at the future, it's dystopian and it's short, so how do we think beyond that? And what's been your journey with that? What have you, in the time that you were in office and beyond now, because you're advising around the world, aren't you? How are people getting to think in more inspiring ways about the future?
Well, I think that, a number of countries are interested in sort of following what Wales did, I suppose, in having a national conversation with their citizens. Now, that's not absolutely perfect, because, of course, we're talking about what do we want to do for people yet born, and we can't ask people yet born exactly what it is that they want to do. But so we're working on our kind of best guess, if you like. And then I think, once those long-term goals are set out, it gives something for people to aim towards, because otherwise, what is it that, I can't tell you what is the mission for the UK. What's the UK that, my daughter, that is an agreed vision for where my daughter who's 9, what sort of UK she will live in. We don't have that. And so it's really powerful when you do have it.
Okay, and you're now advising different people around the world on achieving that vision on that. Can you tell us about what countries are sort of picking it up?
Yes, there's very many countries who are doing various elements of it. So from a UK perspective, Scotland, the SNP committed in their manifesto to having a Future Generations Act, and that's currently going through the government machinery. There's a private members bill in the Irish Parliament. There was a private members bill in the UK Parliament, but it didn't get that far. But there are opportunities now. I mean, if you look at, not getting too political, but there's every chance that there will be a Labour government after the next election. Ed Miliband has proposed in his book that there should be a Future Generations Act for the UK based on the Welsh example. A couple of weeks ago, the Balearic Islands became the next country, set of islands, who have they've produced a Future Generations Act with a commission to oversee it. We're seeing a lot of development around well-being goals and kind of metrics. So I've recently been advising the Australian government there, Canada developing something similar. And I suppose the one that has the biggest potential is that the UN Secretary General has proposed that there should be a UN declaration for future generations, and the appointment this year actually of a UN Special Envoy for Future Generations, the sort of UN equivalent of my role. And that has a real potential to have a trickle-down effect.
Fantastic. So really, I mean, it feels like the start of a big change.
Yeah.
Charles, let's come to you. I want to hear sort of the business story, because you tell me about the genesis of Blueprint for Better Business and the changes that you've seen towards a more future-focused approach. Oh, I don't think we can hear you at the moment. That might be. Hold on a second. Have you try again, Charles?
Can't hear you.
No, might be. Maybe we'll go to Krista first, and then come back to you. Maybe Thomas can, our media person this end, can have a look at that while we're waiting. So Krista, Leaders on Purpose. You're working across so many different parts of this problem, aren't you? You're working with organizations, you're working with governments, you're working with the financial sector, and you're working with business. Tell us about the journey and genesis of Leaders on Purpose.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much. First of all, it's delightful to be here, and what a great group here we are together. Leaders on Purpose was actually started, I spent most of my career working in multinational businesses. And so Leaders on Purpose was started as a research project. I was at Unilever and had gotten a fellowship to Harvard for some of the work that I'd done at Unilever, really in this area, working to help the business transition. And so I needed a project, and it was 2015. It was the year that the Harvard Business Review changed really what it meant to be a top CEO. So they changed the ranking of the top 100 CEOs that year to add, just instead of only ranking businesses on their financial performance, they added a small weighting for environmental, social, and governance performance. And when they did that, we saw this list radically shifted. So the Jeff Bezos had been number one for several years, and had they continued to have that same ranking, probably would still be number one, but he fell to number 87. Warren Buffett fell, off the list, and we saw the emergence of other leaders that were also trying to do what we were trying to do at Unilever, transition our business. And so that became the research project. So brought together a colleague from Harvard, one from London School of Economics, and my friend from the World Bank also came to participate, because as businesses of multinational size transition, there's a lot of actors involved. As you mentioned, we work with a lot of different policymakers, people across different types of sectors. And that's because when you're working with these types of businesses and transitioning, there's a lot of people involved. And the reason for it was really to support businesses like ours in the transition, become more sustainable, and to do it faster, to learn from each other. We don't have time to reinvent the wheel. I didn't know about Charles back then, so could have saved me a lot of time. But so really looking at how do we move faster? What are the things we should be thinking about? We felt like we were pioneering something, and could we do this faster? And multinationals, as you know, are the world's largest global actors, right? Some of them, Unilever, we touch 3 billion people with our products every day. At Procter & Gamble, it's 5 billion. So when businesses of this size make change, it has huge repercussions, and we have a really short period of time to make a lot of change. It was interesting to hear Sophie's comment about, there's a 1 in 6 chance, this researcher saying there's a 1 in 6 chance we'll make it to 2100. So I just was sitting here thinking, God, I have so many friends that are just having children right now. That means if they live to be 75, that's the end, right? So as we think about the future, it's a really pressing issue. So anyways, it's really interesting. So what we're doing is to try to get those big global actors to transition quickly so that we aren't ending at the end of this century.
And are you seeing things shift? Are people, are leaders of businesses really on the journey? Are they able to think long term?
Yeah, absolutely. So this started in 2015. I've been doing this since, like 2012-ish. So in thinking about the work that, how I know that we're hearing a lot of pushback about woke capitalism. And the reason we're hearing that is because there's been a groundswell of interest and a movement in this area and policy and a lot happening to move businesses towards this. So absolutely, we're seeing with the barriers to businesses becoming more sustainable are definitely coming down. We're starting to see that, carbon tax, people paying are going to have to start to pay fines when they're benefiting from creating problems in the world.
Okay. I'm interested. You're sort of talking about that balance between policy and sort of and the business community. I think one of the things that's interesting to me when we talk about short-termism versus long-termism is where profit kind of fits in, and I was interested, especially with your Unilever last year. The FT headline from one of Unilever's major shareholders saying anybody who thinks that mayonnaise needs a purpose has clearly lost the plot. And I'm wondering whether, it's interesting you talking about the top 100 CEO shifting, Jeff Bezos sort of moving to 80. Is there still this view from shareholders that if you're not profitable, you're not successful?
Oh, come on.
Or are they thinking about the purpose-driven business?
So I think what they're thinking about now, it's a really good question. And I would say that it's a false dichotomy to say that you're either purpose-driven or profitable. I think that what we're seeing is that businesses that are purpose-driven are, first of all, they're de-risked. Their employees stay with them longer, which, all of their shareholders benefit from that. The stakeholders, they have greater trust. Their customers, they have closer relations with their customers, so they're able to quickly address issues, those sorts of things. So actually, I would say purpose-driven businesses are the best investment for short and long-term investors. So I wouldn't agree. Certainly there's going to be dips. There's highs and lows, and there's times when there's externalities. There's material issues to a business where they're going to have a dip in their value, their share values. But I would say over the long period and even in the mid to short period, these are the most investable businesses.
Okay. Fantastic. Which brings us on nicely to Charles. So I think you're back with us. Oh no, you're not.
Did you not hear me?
There we go. You're back. I think you're all good. Because obviously, Blueprint for Better Business has been documenting this shift as well. This change in the mindset that's needed within businesses around the world. What's been your experience and your journey?
Well, I mean, we started after the financial crisis in 2012. And the presenting issue at that time was the breakdown of trust, really, between business and society. You know, a lot of people in the UK and elsewhere who are concerned not just from the financial sector, but also BP's Deepwater Horizon, there being corruption scandals in various places. So that was the presenting issue. And for Blueprint, we were lucky that we had a kind of eclectic group of business leaders, plus some academics, plus people from NGOs, some civil servants as well, with the luxury of having pretty much a year to stand back and look at the whole system and say, well, what has gone wrong? And if I summarize the year's work, which then led to the work of the charity that followed, basically the first thought was that ideas are really important. So the market never exists in a pure state. It's always a social and cultural construct. And business leaders don't normally think about the ideas that shape what they do. But basically in the US and UK over the last 40 years until then, two ideas have been hugely powerful. One was Milton Friedman's idea that the purpose of business is to maximize profits for shareholders. And the second is a kind of narrow view of what it means to be human, that people are best assumed for the purposes of work to be atomized individuals motivated by money, status, and power. And so you put those two ideas together, align incentives, the maths all works, and you get the world we live in. And as we thought about it, we said, well, that's why we've got where we've got to, because there's a double disconnect. There's a disconnect between business and society. If all you care about is making money, then you externalize a whole bunch of things, whether those are social or environmental, because they're not your problem. And also, as I think of it now, there's a disconnect, as I think of it, in the human heart. If people are not motivated or invited to be motivated by other things than money, status, and power. And of course, we are self-interested. Of course, these things are important, but all the research from so many different areas, we were talking earlier about well-being, shows that human beings are naturally, three things basically seem to be very important for most people. One is the desire for meaning. The second is that we're naturally relational and therefore find fulfillment in environments where we're cared for and we feel other people are cared for and we feel we belong. And the third is that we want to grow and develop our autonomy and mastery through developing ourselves in the course of our work. And these three things, so our thought of Blueprint was, okay, so these are ideas. We can shift ideas. So the world would be better if business operated to a different idea about its purpose, which is that it should benefit society through producing goods that are good and services that serve, and have in mind a better world that arises from the business of success, and that it should think differently about people and treat people and assume people to have these three other motivations as well as self-interest. And then you get, and only if you have both of these things, the hypothesis was, would you get a better business for the reasons that Krista was just saying. And also you get a better society because the business is orientated for that. And also people will fulfill lives because they will feel that they're valued in an organization doing something that they genuinely believe in. And so we wrote that down on 2 sides of paper, which took a year to write. Each of those bits of paper took a year to write. And then we, as a charity, worked over the last 10 years with mostly large organizations in a non-commercial way. So that was interesting. So the business leaders said, don't take any money from these businesses in the sense of consulting fees, just try and become alongside them and get them curious about the potential development of their organizations. And as I think I wrote in the piece that you kindly asked me to write, Adam, what I found over the last 10 years is that the starting question was often, tell me the business case, Charles, why will doing this make me more money? And then after a few years, that question shifted to genuine curiosity about the unrealized potential of the business. And that's a way better starting point, because if you just go and tell me the business case about money and this is going to be more or less profitable, all you end up doing is reinforcing the current status quo, which is that basically real purpose is to maximize profit. And a lot of the long-term conversation is about long-term and enlightened shareholder value. It's not really fundamentally shifting the paradigm. It's just more social responsibility and different things. And the real challenge of the purpose debate, I think, is to identify how fundamentally different a purpose-led business is, because its fundamental objective changes from creating value for shareholders, short or long term, to creating value for society, of which financial return to shareholders is only one part.
Fantastic. And this is kind of the word that's kind of been entered the lexicon is the word purpose, which I for me gets misunderstood and misused all over the place. But for me, it's that marrying of what's happening inside with what's happening outside in the way that you described.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we have to accept that the world of business goes through these cycles where new words come along, new ideas come along. There are some people who are genuinely inspired by them, but there are a lot of other people who just say, oh shit, we better have this new word because everybody's got it, and they, adopt the language without changing anything else. And I think one just has to accept that that's part of life. But I think the depth of the challenge and it is real. And I think businesses that are embracing this way of thinking are seeing the benefits of it. I don't think it's automatic that if you're a purpose-led business, you'll make more money. I think there's evidence that you probably won't make any less. But the reason for doing it is more that you will create and you will have a much better chance both of mitigating risk and of also creating and contributing to a better society that addresses the huge systemic risks that we're all facing.
And I think it sounds like you're drawing on the work of Alex Edmonds, who I know you've worked with in the past. Does this incredible study of actually what does it mean to a business. He comes from a financial background, and his book Grow the Pie really focuses on that. Let's rigorously look at the evidence of what a purpose-driven approach means to a company. He does, and his work, and we've worked a lot with Alex. And when I meet sometimes highly skeptical CFOs of big companies who just say, look, the rhetoric's fine, but I want the evidence, I want to understand. I just point them straight to Alex's book, and I think it's convinced a lot of people because of the rigor of his approach and the thoughtfulness behind it and the evidence base that he's able to draw on. But in the end, this isn't a technocratic argument. It's actually a mindset change, and you can't, I don't think, persuade people to have a mindset change because of the data. No, I agree. And obviously, with the work that we do, and certainly what the magazine is trying to do, and even where we've gone so far as to have sort of poems in it, you're talking about something which needs to kind of stimulate the emotion in order to create change. We're a great believer that change doesn't come from data. Change comes from the emotional desire to change, the emotional shift. So how do we get people to be emotional about what the journey that we're on? And the interesting thing, listening to all of you, is you're talking about an existential question. Now people have to send themselves on an existential journey, or something has to happen in order for them to want to go on that journey. And I guess more and more with the changes that are happening in the world, with COVID, with the existential threats, even we're being asked more and more to go on that journey of understanding, what this life and what we do with it is about.
That's absolutely right, and often the good consultants that are working with companies provide senior people with disruptive experiences where you've taken out from the day job, often going into nature, often going into social organizations that are trying to address acute social needs. And often it is the emotional connection that then comes from people seeing the world differently through the eyes of people they've never met or never thought about the condition in which they're in, which becomes super powerful and energizing of change.
Yep. Absolutely. Right. So I'm going to open it up for us, the four of us, to have a discussion, and then in about 15 minutes we'll also open it up to questions from people who are tuned in. And I want to talk about inspiring infinity through three lenses. The one was that we touched on with you, Charles, now, which is really this kind of human lens of why we can or can't think long term, then talk about business, and then talk about the impact on society. And I think, Thomas, you're about to bring up a slide which for me I want to use to kind of frame this. So this is a slide from Roman Krasanik's book, The Good Ancestor. It's a graphic from his book, and on it you can see 50,000 years into the past and 50,000 years into the future, and he posits that if the 21st century's birth rate remains constant, and all human lives ever lived, here you can see far outweigh the dead, the living. So the dead, we're looking at sort of 100 billion if we were looking 50,000 years into the past. The living currently, when this book was written, which I think was a couple of years ago, was looking at 7.7 billion. But the unborn generations, if we were looking 50,000 years into the future, at current birth rates, we'd be looking at 6.75 trillion. And for me, this really kind of cements the argument as to why we need to think about future generations, why we need to think long term. But the question becomes really, how easy is it to do? And again, in the book, Krasanik quotes a Chicago study where it's a piece that's focused on the acorn brain. The acorn brain is the part of our brains that enables us to think beyond the immediate and envision possibilities for a future. And he says, with this acorn brain, still 80% of our thoughts relating to the future refer to the same or next day. 14% of our thoughts concern the year ahead, and only 6% of our thoughts looking to the future look more than 10 years ahead. So the question for me becomes, how easy is it for us to really think long term, or are we sort of on a hiding to nowhere? And Charles, I kind of want to start with you, because I know this is something that you guys think about with Blueprint. I think we've lost you again. Yep, you're back. I think you're back.
Okay. Yeah. So it's a great question, Adam. And I think what I think about this is that we can. I mean, I haven't read the book that you mentioned, but I do think there is something about the quality of awareness that we can each inhabit through becoming more conscious of future impacts. I mean, a book I'm just reading at the moment is called What We Owe the Future by William McCaskill, which makes a lot of the same points about the future of humanity and our need to do this. And what strikes me is part of his book is about the moral case for just recognizing the value of people not yet born and to come. And there's an awareness raising that goes there, which doesn't require me to be immediately thinking more about the long-term future in the sense of imagining what that might be, but just having in mind that there will be a long-term future and that this is actually part of what it means to live now. And I think that that's a kind of freeing thing, because it's not necessarily a burden and a desire to try and be constantly in sci-fi world, but it is saying that everything we do, we need to do with a degree of deliberation and awareness of what the long-term consequences are, and to really, I think there is an obligation on us to try and work out, insofar as we can, what they are. I mean, if you think of the AI debate, for instance, at the moment, this is a massive thing. We need to do that. So I think we can. I mean, to what extent our brain states don't make it easier for us to do this, I don't know quite what the evidence is there. But it seems to me that there is something like human here where we can, if we're deliberate about it, choose to spend time reflecting on what those issues are.
Okay, great. Sophie, what are your thoughts on this? You spend your time trying to get people to understand this concept. How easy is it?
Well, it's very difficult, and there's been some interesting neurological studies actually, which looked at the pattern of brain activity when people were asked to think about someone that they have no connection with at all. He is a stranger, and then asked to think about their future selves, and the brain patterns mirror. When we're thinking about our future selves, they are the same brain patterns as if we're thinking about someone who we've never met or have no connection with. So I suppose what that's saying is really our brains are almost like hardwired to ignore the future. And that's where it becomes so critical, therefore, that we are baking into our systems requirements for us to look at to look to the future, and things like we've done in Wales, we legal duties to demonstrate how when you're making policy you've considered future trends and scenarios, how you're looking to prevent problems, and so on. That's where having those sort of baked into the system is so important, because at the moment you've got this kind of perfect storm of, as humans, we're not sort of geared up to think of the future, and our systems are completely short-term as well. So, short-term budget cycles, short-term performance measures, you're going to be monitored and assessed on on what you've delivered within this year, not how you've considered the future. And just going back to that kind of sense around purpose and so on, and the shift away from profit. I mean, it's a particular scenario, really, that we can't envisage that, well, there is no profit on a dead planet. So, you can be as attracted and, geared up for profit as you like. But, it's a really kind of risky strategy if that's all you're focusing on. So there's something for me about, really having those kind of mandatory requirements to shift our thinking. And that's, and we've learned these lessons in Wales. Just because you have a piece of legislation, it helps if it doesn't mean overnight or everyone's going to start thinking long term and so on. But it does give that framework which makes people question, or, my job as an independent commissioner was to go in and have a look whether they'd done that and call them out if they hadn't, and provide support, to give them the tools and capacity building and capability and so on to do that. But, wherever I go in the world, people say, my God, why haven't we all got a Future Generations Act? Well, yes, why haven't we all got a Future Generations Act? It's a complete no-brainer.
Chris, I want to come to you because obviously you're dealing a lot with leaders. And I think I find really interesting with business leaders is there's always these kind of mix of different forces that I think force them to think short-term rather than long-term. Charles, you must have seen this as well. It's anxiety about what the next headline is going to be or what's going to go wrong, or shareholder revolts. CEOs' tenures are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. How easy is it then to convince anybody of a long-term strategy?
Yeah, I think it's such a good question. I do think that the short-term pressures are certainly there. But they're also, very used to looking at risk, and risk is typically a long-term, often risks are, short-term, but there's long-term risks that they need to look towards. I think they're also, also any good business person is looking towards innovation in future markets, right? And sort of looking at positioning from that perspective. So from a very pragmatic perspective, you have to be somewhat future focused with the absolute, you're absolutely right, the quarterly reporting, all of the pressures. There's also, the role of policy, right? And so we've seen a lot of policy coming into place for businesses around sustainability. So that's really lowered the bar in terms of CEOs' ability to think around sustainability, because they're putting it in the risk bucket now, right? So it's risk of fines, it's risks of different expenses, and so I think that we're starting to see a shift. But yeah, it's certainly is, I think there was a headline a couple of months ago that said 94% of CEOs from these big companies are worried about losing their job. So, I mean, that's an existential crisis for their actual roles. So, but the fact is that businesses that aren't moving in this direction can't find the talent, even in this kind of world. So they're not able to find the talent they need to get them to where they need to be. And, consumers, transparency, there's so much pressure to move in this direction. From a consumer perspective, and I've always thought, consumers are so busy, right? We're all so busy. We've got kids, we've got jobs, we've got lots of things. Business has a really important role to play in making it easy for people not to have to think about, just making it easy for them to do the right thing. And those are, we think about purpose-driven businesses, it's about creating market-based solutions to public problems without causing more problems or benefiting from more problems. And so that is an urgent public problem. Consumers, however you want to call them, want to buy things, and they need to buy groceries, they need to buy these things, they don't want to do more harm than good. And so businesses that can help them to do that, I think, are positioned really well.
Is there anybody that you would call out as doing it very well? Is there anybody that you kind of look at and go, wow, they're a really good example of what's possible in the long term?
Well, we do. We have our annual CEO study, it's biannual. So every other year, we identify 15 to 20 leaders and businesses that are really at the forefront. And certainly we look at the focus on, are they really focused on the future transition? Is it the leadership that's doing it? We look at attributed quotes and et cetera. Is it the leadership that's doing it, or is it, someone else within the organization? And so I think there are so many businesses that are doing it really well. And Yeah, we're just in the process now of kind of going through all the numbers and picking our next group of CEOs to participate in this year's study. But yeah, there's definitely some really good examples, and we need more. So.
Charles, what about you? Any that you kind of look at, any companies that you look at and go, hey, these guys have got it right, they're doing it well? We've lost you again, Charles. I don't know what's happening with your audio, unfortunately. Nope. No, we've lost you.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
You can hear me now. I've got a very idiosyncratic laptop. I'm terribly sorry. I don't know quite what it's doing. Let me just add a couple of things to Krista's points. I mean, I think in terms of what's influencing some of these people, and then I can give you one or two examples. But in some of the conversations I have with people, I'm quite struck by, if you become a CEO, once you're there as a CEO of a very large company, you've kind of made it. That's the route often that you've spent your life focused on, and you've achieved it. And then the question does actually often become about legacy. So, what do I now want to leave behind? I may get another CEO job, and yes, they're all under pressure, and yes, we can, there are all these things, but actually they're in the position now where they can do something. And I remember talking to somebody who said he'd just rung his predecessor to thank them for a decision they'd made 8 years ago, which has just come good. And I thought, actually, that's quite interesting as well. So it's somebody who knows that in this role, you are making long-term decisions if you're thoughtful about it, which you're not going to see the benefit of. And one of the problems with the markets is that they are very short-term in terms of how they send signals, which often doesn't, long-term benefits don't get priced in effectively quickly very often. But you can, I think, and I've met some people who are genuinely thinking about their legacy in the longer term. The other factor, which I think I've been quite struck by in my own work, is the number of people who reference their own children as having a big influence on them. And in a way, that's the nearest proxy, because they are the next generation and they're immediate future generations, and they're often quite noisy. And for those who are at school or at university, and it's known that their parents are big cheeses in large companies, they get, it's known, and they often have very strong views about what they think their parents are doing or should be doing. And the pace of change in society is such that this is becoming much more urgent. So I think, there are people who are definitely trying to do this kind of thing well, and are leading thoughtfully around purpose. That's
good. Yeah, and I think there's something I just want to pick on with you, Charles, that I've heard you talk about before. But actually, I want to draw on the work of Richard Layard. I don't know if you know Richard Layard, who's an economist of the Blair government, but he wrote a book called How Can We Be Happier? He sort of boiled it down to one thing. Our governments should be there to enable all of us, to live happier lives. And there's something about thinking beyond ourselves that I think is a recent thing that we understand. Thinking beyond ourselves and finding meaning leads to happiness. We can't just aim at happiness. And there is a meaning aspect to thinking about the future. There is a meaning that we can find in setting up a sustainable future for the world.
I think that's absolutely right. And one of the person who influenced our work at early stages is this incredible writer, Viktor Frankl, who wrote this Man's Search for Meaning from his experience as a psychotherapist being in Auschwitz. And he's one of his phrases, actually it comes from Nietzsche, I think, is he who has a why to live can cope with almost any how. So there's something about keying into something which is always a personal question, and nobody can ever answer it for anybody else, I believe. But actually there's something about the human predicament where we are in search of something that will give our personal lives and ourselves meaning. And I think it's through doing that, as you say, that happiness is kind of best achieved. It's kind of, John Kay's written a book called Obliquity, where he talks about how, the paradox that we achieve things by aiming for something else. And this is one of those things. If you want to run a profitable business, don't aim at running a profitable business. Just aim at doing something brilliantly that people want and need, and you probably will make money. And the same thing, if you want to be happy, aim at something that's really meaningful for you and useful and engages other people, and you probably will find fulfillment in doing that. So I think that's quite a freeing thought in this whole area, because I think the happiness discourse can become very self-referential. The trick is to to decenter in some ways, which is part of, I think, purpose journey is also for organizations.
Yeah, I want to come back to you, Sophie, before we open it up to questions, because you must really see in government this this need to balance, immediate concerns and immediate needs of society. Whether it's jobs, whether it's education, with this long-term thinking. How do those not become diametrically opposed?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it can be, it can be challenging, and people don't always like politicians to take the brave decisions that are needed. So in our approach to not building roads anymore in Wales, because we're investing in public transport as well, the transport minister, who's actually a really brave leader, is getting it in the neck on a regular basis, because despite everyone having signed up to we are declaring a climate emergency. It's a climate emergency other than the road that I need in my patch. And it is hugely challenging. But I think that there are those things that you can identify where meeting needs of current generations and future generations are not mutually exclusive. The point is that we don't even consider that. We don't have a framework for thinking in that way. So if I give you an example of the cost of living crisis at the moment. If we invested in improving the quality of people's homes, particularly around energy efficiency, what we would be doing in the short term for current generations is we'd be taking thousands of people out of fuel poverty. We would be creating thousands and thousands, tens of thousands new jobs in order to put these energy efficiency measures in. In the short term, we would also be keeping people out of, particularly older people, out of our hospital in winter months, but not adding to the kind of the backlog and the waiting lists and the ambulance stacked up outside. And in the long term, good quality jobs has a direct and the most important, one of the most important correlations to our long-term health. And we'd be meeting our climate targets in the long term, and we'd be regenerating those communities for the long term. So what we're trying to say is that you should choose to do the things that are good for both current and future generations and make a contribution across, well, in our case, 7 wellbeing goals, but across your kind of wellbeing metrics. And you need a system to force people to do that, because otherwise what you get, and I'll go back to perhaps another transport example. If we think about, we've got a problem with carbon emissions from transport. It's about 17% in the UK of our emissions from transport. Now, if your sole purpose is to decarbonise the transportation system, then actually, you would invest in mass investment in electric vehicle infrastructure. Would probably be sensible. It would all, grants like Macron did in France, and investment in rolling out the infrastructure and so on. Probably a sensible thing to do to decarbonise. If, however, your goal is not just to decarbonise your transport system, but is to improve the health in the long term of people, is to build connected communities, to address inequality, actually that's not the answer at all, because we're all still sat in congestion, getting fatter and adding to the obesity crisis in our electric cars rather than our petrol cars. We're still not talking to any of our neighbours because we've got in our cars on our drives and off we've gone. There's the long-term implications around batteries and so on and so on. So when you start applying that a different lens, is our outcomes trying to achieve this holistic long-term well-being for people, or is it just trying to do this one-sided thing? You get completely different solutions, and that's the power, I think, of having that framework.
So you're changing kind of the system for thinking, really, is what you're talking about. It's not about one need. It's okay. Let's kind of address it from different points.
Yeah,
really interesting. Right, we're going to open it to questions. I think we've probably got some to start with. So this is from Mulsari Jane. What do you think is the cause of the disconnect between profit, money, capital, and the reality of actual natural resources available? Is it the modernization of society, and how can we reconnect these? So how are we marrying natural resources with profit? Who'd like to open with that? Sophie, do you want to?
Yeah, I can have a go at that. Well, I mean, The reality is we're not at the moment. You might have seen in the news yesterday that scientists are now saying that there's a 66% chance that we're going to hit 1.5 degrees of warming sometime between now and 2027, despite all the platitudes at the various COPs that I've been at and so on around us not doing that. And in the UK, we're currently using about 2.5 times our share of the world's resources, and I think that is because we have had and still have a complete obsession around limitless growth. And the reality is that is going to have to be kept in check, and not just kept in check at some point in the distant future, but it's going to have to be kept in check very, very soon if we're going to start shifting towards this so-called decade of delivery to stop us tipping over to 2%. So we cannot continue to grow in the same way that we have and have a planet to survive on. And the only thing that we can really do is to regulate, is to find those purpose-driven leaders who are going to be shaking up their systems. I'm really encouraged actually by the number of young leaders that are coming forward, and I think that there's a reality for existing leaders and corporates in terms of they won't just have one Greta Thunberg in their organisation; they will have thousands of Greta Thunbergs, right? And they will they will be calling them out, and they won't be coming to work with companies that are not taking into account these sort of that what we need to do in terms of protecting the planet. So there are some political realities for some of the corporates, but there is a very big political reality for governments and governance across the world in terms of how they're keeping this in check.
I think it's really interesting, and it's something that Charles, you and I were speaking about briefly yesterday. Is the fact that it feels like we have given business too much power and regulation and governments not enough. And maybe the answer is to redress that balance. We haven't got you, Charles, unfortunately. There we coming back, I think. Yeah, you're back on.
Okay. So I think it's partly that. It is partly regulation. I worry slightly if we think regulation is going to be the sole answer here, but I do think we live in a world where there is a lack of countervailing powers on very, very large companies. And we only have to see Sam Altman from OpenAI yesterday in Congress calling for the regulation of AI, which I think are very healthy and good thing to see, that where businesses recognize the importance of the role of governments in addressing hugely important and fast-moving technological change in a way which tries to benefit humanity as a whole and society as a whole, recognizing the limitations of businesses that have also got market priorities to deliver. So I think it's given the weakness of government and the relative strength of businesses, I think we live in a world where responsible businesses should be socially active in areas that relate to their business, in the sense of trying to promote a better society through what they do. And they should use their agency and collective action problems to try and do that. And I think we do need more and better regulation. I mean, a carbon price would be a massively helpful thing. And I think part of the reason your question is, the way I would answer the question around natural resources, is that it's this idea. We've been living with this idea that businesses simply exist to maximize profit. And that means they've not had to account for in any way the natural resources use that they have, unless it's priced in some way because of ownership or depreciation. And we do need, as part of regulatory change as well, much better ways of trying to measure and understand the environmental and social impact of what companies do. And there's lots of really excellent work being done to try and, in a way, change the accounting systems so that we're able more effectively to adjust profit for the externalities, whether there's a social environmental, that are used in trying to create that profit. And I think that would be very helpful. There are limitations to it, but I think it's very, very important. But fundamentally, it's all about, I believe, what people are really trying to achieve and what their mindset is as business leaders. And that is what needs to change in relation to the environment and society.
What do you think, Krista?
Yeah, no, such a good discussion, and just really, I think, adding on to what we've already talked about, I think, and actually building on that last point that Charles had, I think that we are seeing a lot. I mean, if we think about it, there's a lot of legacy infrastructure in many ways that needs to transition. It's not going to happen overnight. That's not an excuse. Yeah. It's just a recognition, you know. So building on sort of this idea that we are starting to see different ways, we're seeing like biodiversity credits, you know, asset classes around the ocean, right? So we are starting to see the financial markets sort of grapple with how do we value nature. It's not perfect, it's not right there, but we're starting to see a lot more work in that area. And if we think about the last 2 COP summits, the 2 COP summits ago was the very first time we really saw the capital market show up, right? So it used to just be government, then we saw government and some business, then the one just recently we saw government, business, and capital markets. So that's the system. The system is in the room now. Now, what happens with that is, you know, is hopefully that we can make this transition, but everybody has a role to play. It has to be all the sectors. Yeah,
that's brilliant. Thank you, guys. I know we're coming up to the hour, and I know you guys have got a hard stop. So I'm hoping to do more questions, but it's such a fascinating discussion. I think we could probably go on for another hour. I'm actually going to finish with a semi question that came in from Roland Beck, who I think is in Spain, as a nice closer. And he's saying to all three of you, it makes my heart warm as a father and a businessman and a human to see minds as fine as yours engaged in these most important questions. So thank you, and I agree.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, and we will be taking this talk and also it will be available offline afterwards. We'll be turning it into an article as well, so it can be shared and people can really explore these subjects. So thank you for taking the time to be with us. Thank you to our audience members for joining us. If you're interested in reading, watching, or hearing about more topics such as this, please subscribe to our online editorial, thebeautifultruth.org, and you can also purchase the magazine there and read more about our wonderful contributors today. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.